The deafening crack of a gunshot pierced the stillness of the Montana evening, sending Margaret Porter's heart racing as she ducked behind an overturned wagon. The year was 1877, and what had begun as a routine journey west had descended into chaos within seconds. She could hear the bandits shouting to one another as they ransacked the other wagons in their small caravan, their voices carrying through the crisp autumn air. "Check over there, make sure we ain't missed nothin'," one of them bellowed. Margaret pressed herself against the wooden frame of the wagon, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The others in her traveling party had either fled or been captured. At 22, she had never felt so alone or terrified. Her family back in Boston would never know what had become of her if she died here in this remote stretch of wilderness. A shadow fell across her hiding spot. Margaret stifled a scream as rough hands seized her by the shoulders, dragging her out into the open. "Well, look what we got here," drawled a man with a pockmarked face and yellowed teeth. "A fancy lady from back east, I reckon." Margaret struggled against his grip, but he only tightened his hold, his fingers digging painfully into her arm. "Let me go," she demanded, mustering all the courage she could. The bandit laughed, the sound chilling her to the bone. "Oh, I don't think so, miss. You'll fetch a nice price," his words cut off abruptly as the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked echoed through the clearing. Both Margaret and the bandit turned toward the sound. A lone figure sat atop a sturdy Palomino horse at the edge of the clearing, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his wide-brimmed hat. The last rays of the setting sun glinted off the barrel of his Winchester rifle, which was pointed directly at the bandit's chest. "I suggest you take your hands off the lady," the stranger said, his voice low and steady. "Right now." The bandit hesitated, his grip on Margaret slackening slightly. "This ain't your business, mister. I'm making it my business." The rider nudged his horse forward a few steps. "You and your friends have 10 seconds to clear out before I start putting bullets in places that'll make you regret the day you were born." For a tense moment, Margaret thought the bandit would refuse. Then he shoved her roughly to the ground and backed away. "Boys," he called to his companions, "we got company." What followed was a blur of motion and sound. Gunshots rang out as the bandits and the mysterious rider exchanged fire. Margaret crawled behind the overturned wagon again, covering her head with her arms as splinters of wood rained down around her. When the shooting finally stopped, an eerie silence fell over the clearing. Margaret remained frozen in place, afraid to move until she heard the slow, deliberate crunch of boots approaching. "Madam," the voice was the same one that had ordered her release. "Are you hurt?" Cautiously, Margaret raised her head to look at her savior. He had dismounted and now stood a respectful distance away, his rifle held casually but ready at his side. In the fading light, she could see him more clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30, but his eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship. I don't think so," Margaret managed, her voice shakier than she would have liked. He nodded once, then extended his free hand to help her up. "Name's Jake Lawson." "Those bandits won't be bothering you again." Margaret took his offered hand and rose unsteadily to her feet. "Margaret Porter, thank you for your assistance, Mr. Lawson." Jake's lips quirked in what might have been a smile. "Just Jake is fine, Miss Porter, and you're welcome." Now that the immediate danger had passed, Margaret became acutely aware of the disaster surrounding them. The wagons were ransacked, supplies scattered, and there was no sign of the other travelers. "The others," she said, turning to Jake with wide eyes. "There were 7 of us altogether." Jake's expression grew grim. "I saw a few people running west when I was riding in. The bandits might have taken others." He glanced at the darkening sky. "It'll be nightfall soon. We should find shelter and see about tracking your companions in the morning." Margaret nodded, trying to process the rapid turn of events. Just that morning, she had been traveling with a group of strangers bound for Oregon, pursuing a teaching position that promised independence from her overbearing parents. Now she was alone with another stranger in the wilderness of Montana territory. Jake moved efficiently, gathering what supplies he could salvage from the wreckage. Margaret followed his lead, collecting her small trunk that had miraculously remained intact. "You know how to ride?" Jake asked, leading his palomino over. Margaret nodded. "Yes, though it's been some time." "Good, we'll have to double up for now." He helped secure her trunk to the saddle before assisting her onto the horse's back. The animal shifted beneath the added weight but remained steady. Jake swung up behind her, keeping a respectful distance while still providing enough support to ensure she wouldn't fall. As they rode away from the destroyed caravan, Margaret felt a mixture of relief and unease. "Where are we going?" "I've got a cabin about an hour's ride from here," Jake replied. "It's not much, but it's dry and defensible." The terrain grew rougher as they traveled, the horse picking its way carefully through a landscape of pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Margaret tried to keep track of their direction, but in the gathering darkness, all landmarks soon blended together. Finally, they crested a small ridge and Jake pointed to a clearing ahead. "There it is." The cabin was indeed modest, a simple one-room structure built of sturdy logs with a small stable attached to one side. But to Margaret's weary eyes, it looked like a palace. Jake helped her dismount before taking care of his horse. Margaret waited awkwardly, unsure of her place in this strange man's domain. When he returned, he carried her trunk as if it weighed nothing. "Come on in," he said, pushing open the door. "It's not fancy, but it'll keep you safe." The interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple bed against the opposite side. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs sat near a small window, and various necessities hung from hooks on the walls. Jake set about lighting a fire while Margaret stood uncertainly in the center of the room. "You can take the bed," he said, not looking up from his task. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly, Miss Porter," Jake interrupted, finally turning to face her. "I insist, you've had a rough day." Too exhausted to argue, Margaret nodded. "Thank you." As the fire began to cast a warm glow throughout the cabin, Jake busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans and coffee. Margaret watched him move about the small space with practiced efficiency. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. Jake shrugged. "About 3 years. Came west after the war. You fought in the war between the states, Union cavalry." His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Margaret accepted the tin plate he offered her. "I'm from Boston originally. I was traveling to Oregon to take a position as a school teacher." Jake settled across from her at the table. "Long way to go for a teaching job." "It was more than that," Margaret admitted. "It was a chance to start fresh." Something in Jake's eyes softened at that. "I understand that feeling." They ate in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Despite her exhaustion, Margaret found herself studying her host. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements deliberate. There was a quietness to him that she found oddly comforting. "Tomorrow, I'll help you look for your traveling companions," Jake said as he collected their empty plates. "If we can't find them, the nearest town is Silver Creek, about 2 days' ride from here. They've got a sheriff who might be able to help." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Jake." "I don't know how I'll repay your assistance." He waved away her concern. "No need for repayment, just doing what anyone would do." Margaret doubted that was true. Not everyone would risk their life for a stranger or offer them shelter afterward. As night settled fully over the cabin, Margaret found herself fighting to keep her eyes open. Jake noticed her fatigue and gestured toward the bed. "Get some rest, Miss Porter. Morning comes early out here." Margaret hesitated, then moved to the bed, still fully clothed save for her boots. She lay down on the rough blankets, listening as Jake settled himself near the fireplace. Despite the strangeness of her situation, she felt surprisingly safe. "Good night, Jake," she murmured just before sleep claimed her. "Good night, Miss Porter," came the quiet reply. The sharp pain in her side woke Margaret sometime in the deep of night. At first disoriented in the unfamiliar darkness, she gradually remembered where she was. The pain came again, more insistent, and she realized it wasn't from an external wound but something internal. A soft moan escaped her lips as she curled inward, trying to quell the cramping sensation. It had happened before these sudden, debilitating pains that her mother dismissed as female complaints, and that the family doctor had been unable to diagnose properly. Usually they passed within hours, but they always left her weakened and feverish. "Miss Porter?" Jake's voice came from near the fireplace, alert despite the hour. "Everything all right," Margaret tried to answer, but another wave of pain stole her breath. She heard him move across the cabin, and then he was kneeling beside the bed, concern evident in his features illuminated by the dying firelight. "I'll be fine," she managed. "It happens sometimes." Jake frowned, clearly unconvinced. "You're in pain." It wasn't a question, but Margaret nodded anyway. "It will pass. I just need—" She broke off as another spasm gripped her. Without hesitation, Jake moved to rekindle the fire, then filled a kettle with water and set it to heat. Margaret watched through pain-blurred vision as he efficiently gathered supplies from various corners of the cabin. "My mother suffered from similar pains," he explained, answering her unasked question. "Some herbs seemed to help her." Margaret was too focused on breathing through the pain to respond. Jake worked quietly, steeping what looked like dried leaves in a cup of hot water. The aromatic steam filled the small cabin. "Try to drink this," he said, returning to her side. "It's willow bark and a few other things. Might take the edge off." With his help, Margaret managed to sit up enough to sip the bitter concoction. Jake supported her with one strong arm, his touch respectful but steady. "Thank you," she whispered, settling back against the pillow. Instead of returning to his place by the fire, Jake pulled one of the chairs beside the bed and sat down. "Try to rest. I'll be right here if you need anything." Margaret wanted to protest that it wasn't necessary, that she was used to enduring these episodes alone. But there was something so reassuring about his presence that the words died in her throat. The next few hours passed in a haze of pain and brief moments of relief. Whenever the spasms grew particularly intense, Margaret found herself reaching out instinctively. And each time Jake's hand was there, strong and steady, offering silent support. He spoke little, but his actions said everything. He replaced the cool cloth on her forehead when it grew warm, helped her sip water or the herbal tea, and most importantly, he stayed. His hand never left hers during the worst of it, a lifeline in a sea of pain. As the first light of dawn filtered through the cabin's single window, the pain finally began to subside. Margaret lay exhausted but relieved, aware that Jake still sat beside her, his hand still holding hers. "You sat with me all night," she murmured, her voice hoarse. Jake's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "Seemed like the right thing to do." "Thank you," Margaret said. Knowing the words were inadequate, he nodded once, then gently released her hand. "How are you feeling now?" "Better." "The pain is almost gone." She attempted to sit up, but weakness made her limbs tremble. "Easy," Jake cautioned, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "No need to rush." Margaret settled back against the pillows, suddenly acutely aware of her disheveled appearance and the intimacy of the situation. In Boston, being alone with a man like this would have been scandalous beyond measure. Yet here in this wilderness, conventional propriety seemed less important than human kindness. "I've imposed on you terribly," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. Jake shook his head. "You haven't imposed at all. Rest today. We'll figure out our next steps tomorrow if you're feeling up to it." He rose and moved to tend the fire, giving her space to collect herself. Margaret watched him, seeing him in a new light after the night's events. There was a gentleness to this rugged man that contradicted his weathered exterior. "Have you lived alone all this time?" she asked, curious about the life he had carved out here. Jake added another log to the fire before answering. "Mostly, I work as a guide sometimes, taking hunting parties into the mountains. Otherwise, it's just me and Scout. Scout, my horse." A faint smile crossed his features. "He's not much for conversation, but he's reliable." The simple joke made Margaret smile in return. "It sounds peaceful." "It is. After the war." He trailed off, his expression momentarily distant. "Needed the quiet, I suppose." Margaret understood the feeling all too well. Her own journey west had been motivated by a similar desire for space and silence after years of her parents' constant criticism and the stifling social expectations of Boston society. "I understand," she said softly. "Though I imagine it gets lonely sometimes." Jake's eyes met hers briefly before he turned back to his task. You get used to it, but there was something in his voice that suggested he hadn't entirely. Margaret wondered what kind of life Jake had left behind, what memories or ghosts had driven him to this solitary existence. She didn't ask, sensing that such questions would not be welcome. The day passed quietly. Despite her protests that she was well enough to help, Jake insisted that Margaret rest. He prepared simple meals, checked on his horse, and made minor repairs to the cabin, all while periodically ensuring she had everything she needed. By evening, Margaret felt strong enough to sit at the table for their meal. Jake had managed to catch 2 rabbits, which he'd stewed with some preserved vegetables. "This is delicious," Margaret said, savoring the hearty meal. "You're quite the cook." Jake looked almost embarrassed by the compliment. When you live alone, you either learn to cook or you eat poorly. A wise philosophy. Margaret smiled. "Where did you learn to make that herbal tea? It helped tremendously." "My mother," Jake said, his expression softening at the memory. "She knew all manner of remedies, taught me what she could before she passed." "I'm sorry for your loss," Jake nodded his acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago. What about your family? Anyone who'll be missing you back east?" Margaret hesitated. "My parents are alive and well in Boston. We're not close. They disapproved of my decision to come west. Yet you came anyway. I needed to make my own way." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "My father had my life planned out, a suitable marriage to a business associate twice my age, a proper Boston home, a proper Boston life. Everything decided for me." Understanding flickered in Jake's eyes. "So you ran." "I prefer to think of it as choosing my own path," Margaret said with a small smile. "Though I admit being attacked by bandits wasn't part of the plan." Jake's laugh was unexpected, a rich, warm sound that transformed his face. "Life out here rarely goes according to plan, Miss Porter. Please call me Margaret," she said impulsively. "After last night, Miss Porter seems overly formal." Jake nodded. "Margaret, then." The way he said her name carefully, as if testing the feel of it on his tongue, sent an unexpected warmth through her. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them charged with something new and undefined. Jake cleared his throat and stood to collect their plates. "If you're feeling better tomorrow, we should try to find your companions or make our way to Silver Creek." "Yes, of course," Margaret agreed, though the prospect of leaving the cabin and Jake suddenly seemed less appealing than it should have. That night, despite Jake's protests, Margaret insisted that he take the bed. "You haven't slept properly in 2 nights because of me," she argued. "I'm perfectly comfortable by the fire now that I'm feeling better." After considerable debate, they compromised. Jake would sleep on a bedroll near the fire, and Margaret would take the bed. As she settled under the blankets, Margaret found herself watching Jake as he prepared for sleep, his movements efficient and practiced. "Jake," she called softly. He paused, looking over at her. "Yes, thank you for everything." In the firelight, his expression was difficult to read, but his voice was gentle when he replied, "You're welcome, Margaret. Get some rest." Sleep came easier than she expected, her dreams filled with sunlit clearings and the steady presence of a man whose face she was just beginning to know. Morning brought clear skies and a renewed sense of strength for Margaret. She woke to find Jake already up and preparing breakfast, the domestic normalcy of the scene striking her with unexpected force. How strange that, after just 2 days, this cabin felt more like home than her parents' elegant Boston townhouse ever had. "Good morning," Jake greeted, setting a cup of coffee before her when she joined him at the table. "You're looking better." "I feel much improved," Margaret confirmed. "Strong enough to travel if necessary." Jake nodded, though something like reluctance crossed his features briefly. "We should try to find your traveling companions first. They might still be in the area." After a hearty breakfast, they set out on horseback, Margaret sitting behind Jake on Scout's broad back. The proximity was both uncomfortable and exhilarating. She was acutely aware of the solid strength of him, the way her arms had to encircle his waist to maintain her balance. They rode first to the site of the attack, finding it much as they had left it 2 days prior. Jake dismounted to examine the ground, reading signs that were invisible to Margaret's untrained eyes. Several horses headed east, he reported, crouching to study some indentation in the dirt. Probably the bandits. And here, he pointed to another set of tracks, looks like a group on foot went northwest. Could be your companions. They followed the trail northwest, Jake occasionally dismounting to check the signs. By midday, they had reached a small stream where the tracks seemed to vanish. They could have followed the water to hide their trail, Jake mused, scanning the area. Smart if they thought the bandits might come back. A sudden movement in the trees across the stream caught Margaret's attention. "Jake," she whispered, pointing. Jake immediately reached for his rifle, but relaxed slightly when a familiar face emerged from the foliage. "Miss Porter, is that really you?" Mrs. Wilkins, the elderly widow who had been part of their traveling party, stepped cautiously forward. Behind her appeared Mr. Chen, the quiet man who had joined their caravan in Dakota Territory, and the Davis family father, mother, and their teenage son. "Oh, thank heavens," Margaret exclaimed, relief flooding through her. "You're all safe." Introductions and explanations followed as they crossed the stream to join the group. The travelers had fled during the attack and had been hiding in the woods since, afraid to return to the main trail for fear of encountering the bandits again. "This is Jake Lawson," Margaret explained. "He saved me from the bandits and has been kind enough to offer shelter." Mrs. Wilkins gave Jake an appraising look that made Margaret blush. "Very kind indeed," the older woman remarked with a knowing smile. "Where are you headed now?" Jake asked, steering the conversation to more practical matters. Mr. Davis, a sturdy man with a prospector's weathered face, answered. "We were discussing that very thing. Our supplies are limited, but Mr. Chen thinks there's a settlement not far south of here." "Silver Creek," Jake confirmed. "About a day and a half's journey. I can lead you there if you wish." The offer was met with grateful acceptance. While the group gathered their meager belongings, Margaret found herself standing apart with Jake. "You've done so much already," she said quietly. "You don't need to accompany us further." Jake's eyes held her steadily. "And where will you go, Margaret? Your teaching position is still waiting in Oregon." The question gave her pause. The logical course would be to continue to Oregon as planned. Yet the prospect no longer held the same appeal it had just days ago. "I'm not certain," she admitted. "Events have complicated my plans." Jake nodded, understanding more than she had said. "Let's get everyone safely to Silver Creek first. Decisions can wait." The journey to Silver Creek was slower than Jake had anticipated, given the weakened state of the travelers. They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove, Jake efficiently organizing watches and ensuring everyone had a share of the limited food. Margaret found herself observing him throughout the evening, the natural authority he commanded, the gentle patience he showed Mrs. Wilkins, the quiet respect with which he treated Mr. Chen. He was a man comfortable in the wilderness, yet not without civilization's kindnesses. As the others settled for the night, Margaret approached Jake where he sat slightly apart, rifle across his knees as he took the first watch. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, shifting slightly to make room on the fallen log that served as his seat. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the night sounds of the forest surrounding them. "You're good at this," Margaret finally said. "Taking care of people, leading." Jake looked surprised at the observation. "Just doing what needs doing." "It's more than that," she insisted. "You understand people, their needs and fears. It's a rare quality." He seemed uncomfortable with the praise but didn't dismiss it. "The war taught me a lot about what matters. When you've seen men at their worst and their best, you learn to recognize the difference." "What did you do before the war?" Margaret asked, genuinely curious about the life that had shaped him. Jake was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. "I was studying law in Pennsylvania. My father's wish, not mine. The war came, and afterward. Well, books and arguments seemed less important somehow. So you came west. Wanted open sky and honest work." He glanced at her. "Not so different from your reasons, I expect," Margaret nodded. "Freedom to choose one's own path is precious indeed." Another comfortable silence fell between them. Margaret was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the subtle scent of pine and leather that seemed to surround him. "What will you do after Silver Creek?" Jake asked eventually, his voice low to avoid waking the others. Margaret considered the question carefully. I'm not sure the teaching position in Oregon still feels right for me. Perhaps I'll find something closer. She hesitated, then added softly, I've come to appreciate Montana territory. Jake's eyes met hers in the darkness, a question in their depths that he didn't voice. Instead, he simply said, It grows on you, this country. Yes, Margaret agreed, as do its people. The following morning brought them to the outskirts of Silver Creek, a small but bustling mining town nestled in a valley. The sight of proper buildings and the sounds of civilization were both welcome and strangely jarring after days in the wilderness. Jake led them directly to the sheriff's office, where they reported the bandit attack. Sheriff Mills, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, took their statements and promised to send out a search party, though he didn't sound particularly optimistic about catching the culprits. Bandits are like coyotes in these parts, he explained. Strike quick and disappear quicker, but we'll do what we can. With the official business concluded, the group made their way to the town's only hotel. Mr. Davis insisted on purchasing rooms for everyone, including Jake, as thanks for his assistance. Least we can do, he said firmly when Jake tried to refuse. You saved Miss Porter and got the rest of us here safely. As the others went to settle into their rooms, Margaret lingered in the hotel lobby with Jake. An awkward tension had developed between them since reaching town, as if both were acutely aware that their time together was drawing to a close. Will you stay in Silver Creek for a while? Margaret asked, trying to sound casual. Jake shrugged. A day or two, perhaps, need to resupply before heading back to my cabin. The thought of him returning to his solitary existence while she continued on her journey created an unexpected ache in Margaret's chest. 3 days ago, he had been a stranger. Now, the prospect of never seeing him again seemed unbearable. Jake, she paused, unsure how to express the tumult of feelings within her. Miss Porter, there you are. Mrs. Wilkins appeared at the stairs, interrupting the moment. The hotel is serving dinner in an hour. You must join us, you too, Mr. Lawson. Jake nodded politely. Thank you, madam, I'll be there. As Mrs. Wilkins bustled away, the moment between them had passed. Margaret excused herself to freshen up before dinner, her unspoken words weighing heavily on her mind. The hotel dining room was modest but clean, with several tables occupied by miners and travelers. The reunited caravan members sat together, the shared ordeal having created a bond between them. Jake sat beside Margaret, quiet but attentive as the others discussed their plans. We'll continue to Oregon, Mr. Davis announced. Already paid for the land and nothing's going to stop us from claiming it. Mr. Chen nodded his agreement. I also continue west, business waiting in Portland. Mrs. Wilkins turned to Margaret. What about you, dear? Still set on that teaching position, all eyes turned to her, but Margaret was only aware of Jake beside her, his presence both comforting and unsettling. I'm reconsidering my options, she said carefully. Silver Creek seems like a pleasant town. Mrs. Wilkins' eyes twinkled knowingly. Indeed it does. And I hear they're in need of a schoolteacher right here. The last one left rather suddenly after a disagreement with the town council about proper curriculum. Margaret's heart quickened at this information. Is that so? Mayor's office would know more. Sheriff Mills contributed from a nearby table, clearly having overheard the conversation. Town's growing, lots of families moving in, children need schooling. The possibility settled in Margaret's mind like a seed finding fertile soil. She could stay in Montana, not far from Jake's cabin. They could, but she was getting ahead of herself. Jake had given no indication that he wanted anything more than to see her safely on her way. His kindness might be just that kindness, not the beginning of something deeper. After dinner, as the others retired for the evening, Margaret found herself once again alone with Jake. They stood on the hotel's small porch, the night air cool against their skin. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned a teaching position here in town, Margaret said, breaking the silence. I thought I might inquire about it tomorrow. Jake looked at her sharply. You're considering staying in Silver Creek, perhaps. Margaret gathered her courage. Jake, these past few days. I've never felt so alive, myself. Despite the danger and hardship, or perhaps because of it, I've discovered strengths I never knew I possessed. You're stronger than you know, Jake agreed, his voice gentle. And you, Margaret continued, her heart pounding, you've shown me a kindness and respect I've rarely encountered. When you sat with me through that night of pain, your hand in mine, no one has ever cared for me that way. Jake's expression softened, vulnerability showing through his usual reserve. Margaret, I'm not a man of many words or grand gestures. My life is simple, sometimes harsh. But these days with you have reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten: the comfort of conversation, the warmth of shared laughter. Hope bloomed in Margaret's chest. Are you saying? I'm saying that the thought of you continuing on your way leaves me colder than any Montana winter, Jake admitted. I've grown accustomed to your presence in ways I never expected. Margaret took a step closer to him, emboldened by his words. Then perhaps we should become better acquainted, Mr. Lawson. If I were to take a position in Silver Creek, we would be practically neighbors. A smile, genuine and unguarded, transformed Jake's face. Neighbors, Miss Porter, is that what you're proposing? To start with, Margaret replied, returning his smile, I believe in taking things one step at a time. Jake reached for her hand, his calloused fingers gentle as they enclosed hers. Then I look forward to each step of the journey. The following morning, Margaret visited the mayor's office and discovered that the teaching position was indeed available. By afternoon, after a brief interview with the town council, she had secured the job, set to begin in 2 weeks' time. Congratulations, Jake said when she shared the news. Silver Creek is fortunate to have you. And what will you do now? Margaret asked, the question that had been lingering between them. Jake considered for a moment before answering. My cabin is too far for regular visits to town. I've been thinking it might be time for a change. Hope flared within her. What kind of change? Sheriff Mills mentioned he could use a deputy, someone who knows the territory. Jake's eyes held her steadily. I've been alone long enough, Margaret. Perhaps it's time to rejoin the world. Over the following weeks, as Margaret prepared to begin her teaching duties, Jake worked alongside Sheriff Mills, learning the responsibilities of his new position. They saw each other often, sharing meals, taking walks on the outskirts of town, gradually building something neither had expected to find. One evening, a month after their arrival in Silver Creek, Jake invited Margaret to dinner at the small house he had purchased on the edge of town. The modest dwelling was still sparsely furnished, but Jake had clearly made efforts to make it welcoming. It's lovely, Margaret said sincerely as he showed her around. It's a work in progress, Jake admitted, but it has potential. Over dinner, they spoke of their new lives in Silver Creek, Margaret's experiences with her students, Jake's adjustment to town life after years of solitude. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable familiarity that had grown alongside deeper feelings. As they sat together on Jake's small porch after the meal, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake took her hand in his. I've been thinking about that night in my cabin, he said quietly, when you were in pain and I sat with you until morning. Margaret squeezed his hand gently. I'll never forget it. I knew then, though I couldn't admit it even to myself, Jake continued. Something changed for me that night, the way you trusted me, the way it felt to be needed, to be connected to someone again. Margaret turned to face him fully. It changed for me as well. You showed me what true strength looks like, not just physical courage, but the strength to be gentle, to care. Jake's free hand came up to touch her cheek, his touch reverent. I never expected to find you, Margaret Porter. Never thought I'd find anyone who made me want to leave the solitude I'd built around myself. And I never imagined that being attacked by bandits would lead me to the greatest blessing of my life, Margaret replied, smiling through the tears that threatened. When Jake kissed her, it felt like coming home, like every step of her journey had been leading to this moment, this man, this life she could now envision clearly. 6 months later, on a clear spring day, Margaret Porter became Margaret Lawson in a simple ceremony at Silver Creek's newly built church. The entire town attended, along with Mr. Chen, who had established a successful trading post in the region, and Mrs. Wilkins, who had settled in a neighboring town and took full credit for what she called the most romantic match west of the Mississippi. As they exchanged vows, Margaret couldn't help but remember that night in the cabin, when Jake had sat beside her through hours of pain, his hand never leaving hers. It had been the beginning of their story, a story of unexpected connections, of finding home in the wilderness, of two independent souls discovering that together, they were stronger than they had ever been alone. Later that evening, as they stood together on the porch of their home, now furnished and brightened with Margaret's touches, Jake pulled her close. "Happy?" he asked, his voice soft in the gathering dusk. Margaret looked up at the man who had rescued her in more ways than one, whose quiet strength had become the foundation of her new life. "More than I ever thought possible." As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Jake's hand found hers once more, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The wilderness that had once seemed so daunting now felt like exactly where they were meant to be together, hand in hand, facing whatever adventures awaited them.